Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse.
Welcome back. Today I'm joined by two of the most thoughtful voices on trade and constitutional governance. Boudreaux, who is a senior fellow at the Mercatus Center and a professor of economics at George Mason University, and Scott Lincicome, who is the vice president of general economics at the Cato Institute and adjunct professor at Duke Law School. Hey guys.
Hey. Hello.
Okay, so I want to frame this conversation and maybe with the basics for listeners who might not have followed the legal story. So the Trump administration relied on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, a law from the 1970s meant to limit presidential emergency powers. He used this to impose broad tariffs under what is called an unusual and extraordinary threat to the U.S. economic security, and actually to impose and removed and impose and removed. I guess that's technically really what has been going on. And that decision now has reached the Supreme Court. There was an oral argument on Tuesday. And I want us to kind of unpack on Wednesday, November 5th. And I want to use this moment first to go to you, Scott, and say, before we get to the legal stuff, how do we get there? Like, what has the president done? Because he hasn't just used IEPA; he's used other power. Can you just kind of give us like a broad story or biography of the protectionism that's been going on and since January?
I think it's actually best to kind of explain a little bit of the broader historical context. And that is that, starting almost 100 years ago, Congress decided after the Smoot-Hawley debacle, Great Depression, World War II, Congress decided, look, we can't really be trusted with all these tariff powers because tariff bills back in the day were extremely corrupt and, of course, caused a lot of economic problems as well. So Congress started delegating its tariff powers to the president under the theory that was quite plausible at the time, that the president was the least likely to abuse tariff powers, the most likely to pursue a more open trade, a more reciprocal kind of trade agreement system, had foreign policy concerns, had a national constituency, not domestic protectionist constituencies. And so they're going to give their tariff powers over to the president. They're going to generally agree to liberalize trade broadly, and then allowing the president to kind of pick and choose for tariffs. So Congress passed a series of laws doing that. And Trump used some of these laws during his first term, Section 232, Section 301, and national security law. Section 301 is the unfair trade China law. Now, these laws had not been used much either. And Trump abused those laws. But at the very least, everybody kind of understood these were tariff laws, right? And in January, when Trump first took office, guys like me were predicting that Trump would use these laws again. He would expand the China tariffs. He'd go after semiconductors and pharmaceuticals with Section 232. And Trump did none of that, at least not at first. In fact, very early on, he announced a national emergency related to fentanyl from Canada, Mexico, and China. And the national emergency unlocks these broader powers under the IEPA. And then Trump imposed tariffs on imports from those countries. And this was the first time in history that IEPA had been used this way. IEPA was typically considered to be a law about sanctioning bad actors, terrorists, or government supporting terrorism overseas. It was not about just imposing broad-based tariffs. And then fast forward a couple months, And Trump did it again with the Liberation Day tariffs, which are a truly global tariff regime. This is the one that, of course, caused stock markets to freak out and all these governments to run to Washington begging for deals and all this. And this one was even more shocking because now you're talking about not just tariffs on a couple countries for something that's plausibly related to national security, but they were doing it because of the trade deficit, which we've had a trade deficit for 30 plus years. Calling that an unusual and extraordinary threat, an emergency, is crazy, right? And of course, economists would tell you that tariffs can't fix those things and all of that. But regardless, they did it, and it's now been up to a bunch of small businesses to file lawsuits to try to stop it. Because Congress... Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, because Congress could theoretically get its Article 1 powers back here, declare the national emergency to be moot, or to actually, revise or completely negate the tariff, revise IEPA, negate the tariffs. But Congress, of course, is little more than a debating society today. And even though the Senate has acted a little bit to try to stop these tariffs, the House of Representatives literally changed the definition of time. They changed the calendar so that the House will not vote on the emergency. So effectively, Congress is off the table, right?
Because in the law, in the legislation, or in the statute, or whatever, they had to. There was a timing. It was like 150 days, or was it
within 15 days?
15.
The House and Senate have to vote on it. It's called a privileged resolution, and you basically. You kind of have to force a vote. But what the House did, the Speaker and his buddies effectively said, no, those calendar days, they don't apply. They changed the rules. And there's nothing the Senate can do about it.
If these don't apply, what applies?
Well, they basically said that a calendar day is not a calendar day for the next until 2026.
Sometime in the spring.
Right. So it just basically suspends the counting of days, right? And again, there's nothing the Senate can do about it. It's a House.
So the administration has also used Section 232 and Section 301, right? It hasn't done just everything through IEPA.
Exactly. And those laws have big problems. Clark Packard and I wrote a paper in October of last year kind of detailing all of the laws and noting some of their problems and how Trump could abuse them and begging Congress to get in the game and the Biden administration at that time to just reform these laws to make the threat of all of this mess a little less, right? And make things a little more predictable, even though we knew Trump was going to do tariffs because he loves tariffs. And Congress, of course, did nothing. And Trump has used those other laws as well. And like I said, those laws have problems, but they are wildly different and better, honestly, than IEPA. And they're for a couple reasons. One is they have substantive and procedural limitations. You have to have, for both of them, you need to have an investigation and a report. There's notice and comment period. So it takes months and months between the time you say, we're going to investigate imports of autos or semiconductors, and by the time you actually get tariffs. And that matters for market actors in the West. The other big thing is that once you have those tariffs in place, it takes a while to change them. So, that gives, again, there's more time for the market to react. There's more time for guys like us to have data and investigate, what's happening in the market. IEPA has none of that. IEPA, as I've said, really just puts a little tariff switch in the Oval Office and allows Donald Trump to flip it on and off anytime he wants for any reason. He can wake up on a Friday morning and decide he doesn't like a Canadian television ad and apply tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of imports as of Monday morning. He can get sweetheart deals from companies like Apple that bring him little statues into the Oval Office and suddenly give Apple a big tariff exemption. He can run around the world threatening all sorts of other tariffs for Brazilian political trials, or he doesn't like how India is buying Russian oil, even though we told India to buy Russian oil. So on and on and on, right? IEPA is just fundamentally different because of that. And the other big thing, of course, is that IEPA doesn't mention the word tariff and has never been used to apply tariffs. And it is because, as you said, IEPA was actually considered to be a limitation on presidential powers to affect international commerce, because Nixon had applied global tariffs for a few months under a different law, although there is now some debate about that. And Congress saw that and said, whoa, we don't want the president doing that. So we're going to create a law called Section 122 that applies to what Nixon did, which was a balance of payments crisis, supposedly. Very temporary. It has a maximum limit of 15%. So we're going to create that for Nixon. And then we're going to create this other law that's going to be the IEPA, that's for other situations, right? Again, not tariff situations. So that's why this lawsuit has taken place, because small businesses whose livelihoods were on the line, and I should note, small businesses, not big businesses. Puts the lie to the idea that tariffs help, or that free trade helps the big business. No, this is all the little guys are out there. The big guys, they get tariff exemptions, they modify their supply chains, whatever. The little guys sued, and they said, you can't do this, right? And the lower court at the Court of International Trade said that you're correct. The administration can't do this, in a very sweeping, unanimous decision that was pretty shocking in May. The DC District Court said the same. The Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, because that was, of course, appealed, also said the same. That was a narrower, a more split decision. And now we're at the Supreme. It was 7-4. Yeah.
7-4.
So it was an en banc decision, which is good. It means all the judges on the circuit were hearing the case. And then, of course, that was appealed to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, to its credit, expedited the case. And we had oral arguments this week.
So, John, I don't know that it has any bearing on the. Okay, go ahead. You have.
Well, I just want to add one thing to what Scott said, which was a really nice summary. The trade deficits that Trump said are the national emergency justifying his use of these powers is not just the trade deficit. It is bilateral goods trade deficits. So a bilateral trade deficit, meaning so-called trade imbalance of one country with another, is a completely economically meaningless concept in a world of more than two countries, which of course our world is. A goods trade deficit has no more economic meaning than a yellow things trade deficit, or a things bigger than a bread box trade deficit. The United States economy is 80%
services, yeah.
And so it's not just trade deficits; it's these economically meaningless bilateral goods trade deficits, which are just nuts. It boggles the mind.
Yeah,
how economically imbecilic this is.
And adding insult to injury, the Trump administration also applied tariffs to countries with which the United States has trade surpluses. So,
yes. Like the UK, right?
And Brazil. And so they didn't even attack. I mean, Don is, of course, 100% correct that it's a meaningless statistic, but they didn't even go after the meaningless statistic.
That's right.
And this, I think, is a nice segue to the Supreme Court case, because the Supreme Court case, one of the issues in this case is, according to the administration, the courts can't even look at the declaration of a national emergency. They can't question it, right? So they just have to take their word for it, no matter how ridiculous. So you could have a national emergency that says that, redheads are a threat, and thus we need to ban the, travel of redheaded people. Now, gingers are a bit suspect here and there, but it's insane, right? And
you could have the reverse, that they're in danger, and hence,
yes,
yeah.
Right.
I can't even imagine the policies that would go into fixing that.
Right. And so the Trump administration says, courts, we are the sole arbiter of what is and is not a national emergency. And too bad if you don't like it, regardless of the economic insanity, or again, because it's not just the trade deficit, it's fentanyl from Canada. There's more fentanyl going into Canada from the United States than coming from Canada. It's loopy stuff. And then, of course, there's all these other things. The Brazilian Bolsonaro's on trial in Brazil, and that's justifying even higher tariffs on Brazilian imports. So that's, I think, one of the big issues in this case is that if you are to accept the administration's arguments, the president can declare a national emergency for any reason and then can do almost anything that affects international commerce, which in a global economy is almost anything. And the courts should not question that either, because it has a overlap with the president's Article 2 and foreign affairs powers. And too bad. If you don't like it, then Congress can somehow get veto-proof majorities and rewrite the law. But until then, the president gets to do whatever he wants. And one of the bright moments in the oral arguments was you had Justice Gorsuch primarily, but several other justices as well, which was good to see, started probing the administration, the Solicitor General, on just how far this could go. The big question from Gorsuch was, well, could the next president declare a climate emergency and suddenly apply tariffs on gasoline and on automobiles? And I could take that further, because they could also apply capital controls. They could go seize foreign-owned refineries in the United States. I mean, that's what this law potentially allows. And the Solicitor General said, yeah, that's fine. He hemmed and hawed for a second, but he finally said, yeah.
He even said it's very likely.
Yeah. So that's what we're dealing with.
It's not a good look.
Yeah. And that's why when I talk about this case, I say, look, it is about a lot more than tariffs. Tariffs are bad. They've been doing bad things in the U.S. economy for all the reasons that Don writes beautifully about all the time. But it's not really about tariffs. It's about, do we have a king or do we have a president? And do we have a constitution that says that these powers are primarily, they're Congress's powers, and Congress can delegate them in dribs and drabs and limited ways, in ways that have clear, defined boundaries? Or can the president just wake up on a Friday and decide he doesn't like a Canadian TV ad and crush American businesses?
Even if I were a pro-protectionist person, highly protectionist person, I would hope the Supreme Court would rule 9-0 against Trump on this. It's ultimately not about the tariffs, as Scott says. It's about a president claiming basically monarchical-like powers.
Yeah.
Monarch-like powers.
And I should add that if you are a protectionist, the other reason you want Trump to not have this power is that one of the big problems the use of IEPA has caused in the U.S. economy has nothing to do with the tariffs themselves. It has to do with the uncertainty that IEPA creates, because IEPA does not have a notice and comment period. It does not have investigation. And so when one guy, especially a guy as erratic as Donald Trump, can just simply crush, trillions of dollars of commerce overnight, it causes investors to seize up, right? And if you look at manufacturing surveys in particular, survey after survey after survey, they all say the same thing. They say, yeah, we're dealing with higher raw materials costs, and that's bad. And it's not a great environment for demand and all this stuff, but it's the uncertainty that's killing us. The uncertain, we are not hiring, we are not investing because we have no idea.
That's actually a good segue, even though I don't know that it has any bearing on the outcome of the ruling. Or on the argument whether it's legal or not. But Don, can you kind of give us a kind of a summary of what are the consequences of actually this protectionism above and beyond the uncertainty?
The economic consequences. Adam Smith knew everything that I'm about to say. In principle, if the goal of the tariffs ultimately is to enrich the economy, if we put aside genuine national security concerns, if the goal of the tariffs is to enrich the economy, they simply won't. Tariffs restrict our access to goods and services. When you restrict people's access to goods and services, they get less of it. And by the way, most of those goods and services to which our access is restricted by the tariffs are not final consumption goods. They're intermediate goods or capital goods. So about 60%, the economist Mark Perry estimates, of American imports today are inputs used in production here on American soil. And so you're raising the costs of American producers, including American manufacturers, which is one of the reasons why the information that Scott reported a moment ago is true. A lot of manufacturers are being harmed by these tariffs because their input prices are rising.
As in jobs in manufacturing in manufacturing actually gone down faster than.
Yeah, we're down about 40,000 manufacturing jobs since all this stuff started.
Yeah, and so just as a general rule of improving the economy, tariffs have no record, quite the opposite, of working. They make economies less dynamic, less innovative, less productive. And insofar as reviving manufacturing employment, which is a more specific goal that a lot of the Trump people and other protectionists, including protectionists on the left, have for tariffs, this is crazy. The studies vary in the specifics of their estimates, but no serious economist doubts that the great bulk of the reduction in manufacturing employment over the years, which began, by the way, before any of us were born, it began in the mid-1950s, as a share of total employment. The great bulk of that decline is due to labor-saving technology and the fact that as an economy grows richer, people demand relatively more services than they do goods. And so the decline in manufacturing employment as a share of total employment that began in 1954 pretty steadily, it was not, you cannot blame trade for it. You blame innovation, you blame efficiency for it. And so if they want to revive manufacturing, truly want to revive manufacturing employment, let them be honest. Let's say we want to make the economy much less efficient, much less innovative. We want to reduce the productivity of American workers.
Which means lower wages.
Which means lower wages, exactly. You reduce worker productivity, you reduce workers' real wages, and so you reduce the standard of living.
Yeah. I want to add two quick things that I'd add. First is even the best models of these tariffs, the kind of elegant, optimal tariff ones show that, you can maybe increase manufacturing output, even jobs versus what they would have been overall. But the problem is you're trading the good manufacturing. You're getting less of the good manufacturing, the advanced stuff, aerospace, transportation, all of these things that have extremely complicated global supply chains. And what are you getting instead? You're getting like furniture production and t-shirt production. So there's a compositional shift that you're really not getting much additional aggregate output employment. You're actually you're trading the good stuff for the bad stuff, right? But the second problem, though, is that that's the optimal case. That's the elegant model. In reality, the tariffs we've gotten are so complicated and ever-changing, and they have so many loopholes and exemptions and rules that they are extremely costly just to figure out what the heck is going on. And the Federal Reserve over the summer estimated that just compliance costs for this trade regime is going to cost $40-50 billion for American manufacturers. So even you can't even look at those elegant models, because in reality, and this is something that we're working on right now at Cato, we're working on this kind of tariff complexity thing, because our tariff system went almost overnight from something pretty simple to something mind-bogglingly complex. And that has real costs as well, beyond all the costs Don mentioned.
So,
it's not draining the swamp. It's
just
filling.
to talk to something that will be talking to people. Speaking to people, DHL has actually said it won't bring anything in the country like that is basically not below the whatever the minimum.
De minimis.
So right there, like this company was like, we used to do this, we're not doing it anymore. Too complex. We've heard horror stories of UPS and like basically the international shippers, like with like goods at the border, the customer, the custom control people not knowing how to deal with the goods that are arriving. It's just because it depends on what it is, where it comes from, like what it's made of, what it's just, and then there's just like, and so faced with this enormous complexity, they either just basically just pile the stuff on that American people have actually bought. Usually they're consumers who've bought goods from abroad. I don't know if it applies. I don't think it applies to kind of the like most of what we import are inputs, but I definitely when if you buy a pillow from France, it's like it's so complicated that there's a good chance that actually in the end it's going to be either put in a pile where like we don't know what to do with it, or even destroyed.
Yeah.
They've talked about how
customs purgatory.
Yeah, I mean, and it just like they don't know what to do with it, and then so that like to claim that actually this is not actually an enormous cost for customers who've paid for that stuff to come in, and that this is not. I mean, the foreign company is actually kind of pocketed your money, and now it's not their problem that and so it's just the cost is utterly enormous.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of stories that have been written over the last few months about how even the most sophisticated customs and logistics professionals are stumped as to how to calculate tariffs. So the Canadian Broadcasting Company had a great story of a guy that sent the exact same product from Canada within a couple weeks and got tariff bills. His customers got tariff bills that were $50 for one and $600 for the other. And then, but the kicker is that if you get it wrong, guess what happens? Well, then customs fines you. Or worse, DOJ is now like investigating some importers because they got their tariff calculations wrong. So it is just a wildly onerous system that, of course, at the end of the day, discriminates most against the little guys.
And we're gonna see the cost of all of this really hitting customers probably in the next few months, depending on when the Supreme Court is going to decide. Because like one of the stories that has been so there are a few things. What we learned from the first Trump trade war is that 100% of the burden of the tariffs were shouldered by American consumers, right? That's and in part there was also a lot of retaliation. This time around, the anomaly is that there's been less retaliation, and I think it's because countries, maybe like governments, are worried about the repercussion of retaliating, but there's been some, right? But also we have seen companies not actually push. I mean, they're consumers. So in my opinion, it's still 100%. The burden is on American consumers. But we have seen companies, rather than push all the cost of the tariffs on the final consumers, actually hold off and reduce their margin. Right. I mean, like
so it's like a corporate tax. So it's but it's a corporate tax, of course, that's before they've actually sold the product. That's what's so bad. They say, oh, it's fine. The companies are eating the tariffs, but you don't understand that tariffs are paid up front. At least corporate income taxes, which of course we have big problems with, at least they're paid after you have sales and profits. No. You don't even know if you're going to be able to sell that product. You don't even know if you're going to make a profit for the year. You have to pay it up front, which again, if you're a medium-sized company, who has $1 million lying around just so they can get their inputs into the country, right? It's just brutal.
But like, let's assume for a second that just kind of like the tariffs, we stay in limbo for like, I don't know when they're going to give their ruling, right? And it's just basically like companies, there's so much they can do to actually hold off until they push the cost onto consumers. So it's not crazy to think that the burden imposed onto consumers, final consumers, by the tariffs is only about to get worse, right?
Look, even if in some miracle happened and all these companies say they commit, okay, we're just going to continue to eat the vast bulk of the cost of these tariffs, Well, what that does, in addition to the problem that Scott brought up, what that does is it reduces the rate of return on those firms over time. So you're going to get less entry into those industries. Some of those firms will eventually go bankrupt. That will cause output from those industries to fall, ultimately causing prices for consumers to go up. There's no escaping the fact that these tariffs, the cost is going to fall on consumers.
And Vera, to answer your question to kind of the granular level, a lot of businesses have said that they're holding off on full kind of passing on more of the tariff cost until they see what the Supreme Court does. It's a huge, I think, open question though, as to how that plays out, right? One of the big differences between this tariff mess and the last tariff mess is that, inflation in 2018 had been really low, for so long, and consumers were almost oblivious to price hikes. Now, of course, we've lived through a pretty painful inflationary period. Inflation's still above where it should be, in part because of these tariffs, right?
And going back up.
Yeah, and so consumers are far more sensitive to price hikes than they were. So you hear a lot of companies saying, honestly, we can't pass on the tariff cost fully because consumers will just balk. Now that's bad too, right? For the reasons Don mentioned. But we just don't know. It's, I think a lot of it's going to be industry by industry, company by company. But the other thing is that we always have to remember that as good as a Supreme Court ruling against these IEPA tariffs would be for the companies, for the economy, for the rule of law, they're not going to stop. They're going to go back and use these other tariff laws. And they're going to reverse engineer these global tariffs any which way they can. And they've already started. They've been very open about saying they're going to do it. And so for companies, that's the other thing. What's coming next will be another question that I think will affect how they decide to do this.
Well, so let's go back to the Supreme Court. So there were a bunch of arguments. Some so let's start with like the IEPA talks about regulation and not taxes. Do you guys? There was a conversation like this. A lot of people on our side have made a lot about this. Do you think actually that that distinction is useful, Scott?
So I know that it was a major part of the challengers' argument. I have a law degree, but I'm an economist. As an economist, I can understand someone saying, "Look, putting a tax on something is just one way of regulating that something. In fact, in some ways, it's a more modest way of regulating that something." And so I'm uneasy with the argument that says, well, tariffs are not mentioned in IEPA, and therefore that means that the only regulation is mentioned, and so the tariffs aren't allowed. Now, Ilya Soman, probably Scott too, Ilya Soman tells me, no, lawyers love that kind of argument, all right? And so what in this case, if that's an argument that the courts find compelling, then I'm happy to go with it.
Yeah. It strikes me as much more of a strategic play than it is a fantastic argument, right? I will say though that one of the things I wish had come up more in the oral arguments about this, because they spent a ton of time on the language of the statute and whether it allows for tariffs and all this stuff. But and this was Timothy Sandifer, who's out at now I can't remember.
Goldwater.
Yeah, thank you. Goldwater wrote a great amicus brief on this and explained that actually it doesn't matter that IEPA allows for even more destructive things like embargoes and doesn't allow for tariffs. That actually makes perfect sense because IEPA is supposed to be an emergency statute. And you can totally, and in fact, if you trace IEPA back, it goes back to World War I. It was a wartime statute. So it makes perfect sense that the commander-in-chief, during a time of war, might need to impose an emergency embargo of some sort, right?
But the Trading with the Enemies Act.
Yeah. Exactly. And so tariffs just don't make any sense if you understand what the law is trying to do. A tariff doesn't make any sense because it's especially the tariffs we have, it's going to allow imports just fine. It's not even applied to enemies. And so I wish they had spent a little more time on that particular point, because there's a very coherent, clear rationale for why the president might have temporary embargo authority and not have tariff powers. But as a broader point, I think one of the things you have to remember is that there are several liberal justices on the Supreme Court still, and those justices are probably uncomfortable with doing things that we libertarians like embracing the non-delegation doctrine, which says Congress can't delegate, broad powers to the president, even doing things like, trying to narrow the scope of administrative and executive authority, because of course, a lot of lefties want a very powerful administrative state. So as a strategic matter, it makes perfect sense that if you want to grab those 3 votes, you're going to play up the textual thing because you want to nail those and then work on the others.
But you're right. Sandefur's argument, that's an excellent point.
So I don't know if I understood it correctly, but I thought, I agreed with, my instinct was was done, this kind of tax versus regulation kind of doesn't make a ton of sense. But an argument that I found convincing, if I understood it correctly, was the Chamber of Commerce brief points out that if the court actually accept the logic that regulation and taxes, it's all the same, basically it means the same power could be applied to exports, right? Taxing export, which the Constitution explicitly forbids.
Yeah, and that came up a little bit in the discussion.
I thought actually that was kind of it was kind of an important point, which obviously that the Constitution explicitly forbidding taxing export has not stopped President Trump from extracting a tax from NVIDIA for selling stuff to. But I thought that was actually kind of a fair argument for kind of having a distinction, maybe.
Yeah, and there is a distinction also, just in the sense, and they got into this a good bit in the oral arguments, that the tax power explicitly and tariff power explicitly lies with the Congress. And they went through a long section, and the Solicitor General was stumped on this. They said, they asked him, do you know of any instance in which Congress has allowed for regulate by itself to mean tax? And because they said it's always both. They always in the statutes will include both. If they want to give that power to the president, they'll say tax and regulate, right? They don't just say regulate. And he had none, 0. So again, I think that for us, we want these big, fundamental, broad decisions. But at the end of the day, as Don was saying, lawyers like the statutory stuff.
You can imagine talking about emergency. I was going to say President Mamdani, but he obviously can't be president. That said, maybe if we get there, who will care about norms?
He's 30. He's 34. He's only 1 year away from being eligible.
Yeah, but I think he's not born in the U.S. So.
Oh, okay.
Right. So, but I was just kind of you can imagine, or President AOC saying there's a inequality crisis. So then the president can invoke IEPA to actually just tax, and set rates and change them and for rich people. Right. So in this case, it should kind of make things, uncomfortable. So we've talked about the fact that the Solicitor General claimed that the court cannot second guess the president, and why we find this just terrifying. But now I want to talk about the landscape of the amicus briefs. Is that how you would say it? And it was just kind of a really strange coalition because this case produced kind of one of the most unusual lineups in recent memory, where you had conservative and libertarian groups, like so Cato, so you, Scott, and actually Cato submitted two briefs.
Yeah, we had a trade policy brief and then a law legal brief. So Cato did the legal brief.
It was like Brent Skirp did the other one. With whom did he do it with?
I think Tommy Berry, but I can't remember.
Yeah. So it's like Goldwater and TU, the Chamber of Commerce, like the kind of the conservative libertarians, all opposing Trump's position, while a group like you also had like the Brennan Center, like you just had kind of you had this really broad coalition. So what do you make of this? I mean, this kind of gave me some hope, actually, not for the outcome, but for the state of this country, that there's still kind of point of reference that we can all unite against. But what do you guys make of this coalition?
I'm with you. I was pleased to see it, because it is almost comical, the imbalance. On the one side, you have 30 plus briefs from a really diverse range, and not just groups. You're talking about former government officials, Democrat and Republican, all sorts of academics, left-leaning and right-leaning, and then all these groups. Everybody's saying this is bad. On the other side, you had like 6 people, like one law professor, and then the America First policies. I mean, really, very kind of Trump supporting folks. And it just showed that this is only a political matter. As a matter of law, economics, whatever you want to call it, it is a slam dunk for the good guys. It is only, as a political matter, a open question.
Yeah. I agree. Nothing to add to that. That is a silver lining around this.
Yeah, and if you look at the Economist brief as well, right? And Don, I think you signed that one, right? Yeah. Again, you had economists from across the spectrum sign this, right? The NTU brief had hundreds more. I mean, this is not a partisan this is not a policy question, right? A left versus right. It is not even a free trade versus protectionism issue. It is really about these more fundamental issues on which still a lot of people agree. I always call it, there's this coalition of the sane, right? Like I disagree with Jason Furman about a lot of stuff, right? But Jason and I on this stuff, yeah, I mean, we're like hand in hand. And there's, because this is not, this is,
I've been retweeting Justin Wolfer.
Right. And because this is really horseshoe theory. It's the anti-horseshoe theory, right? So horseshoe theory is far left and far right. They all agree. Oh yeah, nationalize U.S. steel, and oh yeah, apply global tariffs for whatever reason you want. In the middle, you have all these folks that go, whoa. Like, we'll disagree on Medicare, we'll disagree on the budget, but on this, no, this is insane, and that's good to see.
The other big divide, like it's like big business versus small businesses, right? Like the small businesses just have been piling on about how it hurts them. Meanwhile, big businesses have stayed silent. In fact, I think that part of the not pushing the prices, all the cost of the tariffs onto consumers, final consumers, is it from big businesses has also kind of been maybe a reflection of the fact that they're hoping they can get some sort of dispensation from the tariffs in the way that small businesses can. So what do you? I mean, is this traditional to see? I mean, especially in this case where the tariffs are so. I mean, so they're everywhere. They're falling everywhere, and I understand that some companies got some big exemptions. That was kind of really striking, the absence of big business siding with any.
And it's not just the fact that big businesses are better able than smaller businesses to gain access to people with government power and to lobby for exemptions and privileges. That's a big part of it. It's also the fact that big businesses can, because they're big, they can spread fixed costs over a larger amount of output, meaning that the relative impact of these costs wind up being smaller on big businesses than on smaller businesses. History is filled with examples of big businesses basically saying, "Oh, don't throw me into that briar patch," because they understand that this regulation, that kind of taxes, protectionist regime, while it'll cost me a little bit more, it's going to cost my competitors who are smaller than me much more in proportion, and that's going to give me a competitive advantage. And so there's another force in raising, in addition to the direct effect of tariffs raising prices, to the extent that it does in fact create or enhance monopoly power here in the domestic economy, that prices will rise to that extent as well.
Yeah, and you're seeing this actually quite a bit in the press, because large multinational manufacturers, they're forum shopping basically for the cheapest place to produce. They're not necessarily onshoring production, but they have like 8 different facilities around the world, and now with a wildly differing tariff regime, they're going to find the cheapest one, and they hire a bunch of very expensive lawyers and customs pros to figure this all out. Little guys just don't have any of that, right? And so I agree with you, Vero, that it was surprising that at least if you had listened to this kind of scuttlebutt around town before all of this started, there were a lot of law firms that were actually shopping a case to the big businesses because this was if the IEPA bazooka were fired. They had it ready to go. And I think one of the real surprises was after the first fentanyl tariff salvo, there were no lawsuits, and it was a bit shocking. But it's for I think the reasons that we've described, but also because look, Trump is uniquely willing to go after companies that advertise raising prices, that challenge his actions. And I think that's the other thing, right? Just a lot of businesses were afraid to do that, especially if it wasn't life or death for their business. And for these small guys, it is life or death. And, who cares if you offend some Trump-loving Republicans because you're going to be out of business anyway, right? And so it was great to see them challenge it, but also what a massive shout out to our public interest law firms and all of these groups that, are basically representing these small businesses for free, right? And I think it's a massive testament to the need for, particularly in the Trump era, the need for these places to be more aggressive in suing the government on behalf of the little guy.
Yeah. So, before, is there another issue about the oral argument that I haven't covered yet? Like that you think we should cover?
I'll tell you the one thing. So I was mostly pleased with the oral arguments, and I've boosted my odds of the good guys winning, although I still don't think it's a slam dunk. But I was very frustrated by the discussion of tariff refunds.
I wanted to ask you this.
This is going, even if the good guys win, I think the next big battle is going to be over getting all this money back. Because you're talking about, it's probably going to be north of $150 billion in illegally collected taxes. As we wrote in our amicus brief, there actually is an easy way for the government to refund these because every entry, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of them at this point, has a little code assigned to it by customs. This is all automated, and almost all importers have an electronic account, like we have a checking account, ACH, direct deposit stuff, right? And customs could, over a matter of a few months, simply reverse that, right, and put the money back into these importers' accounts. Now there would be edge cases and whatever, but as a general rule, customs could do this pretty easily. The government has issued these automatic blanket refunds in the past in several instances that we brought up, but it is not mandatory that the government pursue this. And there is a bit of a question about whether the court can even mandate it. But if they don't go the easy way, it could be very, very hard. It could and this came up a little bit, and the plaintiffs' attorneys, for again, I think strategic reasons, because they didn't want to scare the justices about this, said, "Oh, yeah, it could be messy, and we're only talking about our plaintiffs." But I think that's going to be a huge issue, even if the good guys win.
So the way I thought about it, and I again totally independent of the legal question, is like, I don't even kind of quite see why the administration would have to refund these. Like, because let's assume that they really truly didn't know they were doing something that was unconstitutional and illegal, economically destructive and all of that. Like, let's say they don't know it's unconstitutional. They've done it. Okay, now from now on, they're not doing it. And it's not an argument, and it's not a solid argument, but I could see that for the piece of kind of like not kind of imposing even more destruction. It's unfair. There's no doubt how unfair that is, because it would be like kind of like, but I mean, I'm kind of like, it's kind of a way to split the apple or whatever, like.
Yeah, well, there's I'll direct you to our brief on this, because there's actually a lot of settled case law and practice that if tariffs and other duties are found to be illegally collected, the government has to refund them. The really bigger question is how that happens.
Yeah.
And
then as I'm saying this, by the way, I'm kind of like, I wouldn't want this in any other case. Like, if you come and you take, the money that is on my counter because you don't know it's yours, I still want it back.
Right. Intent doesn't matter here.
As I was saying this, I was kind of like, meh.
But if I imagine that the Trump administration will be resistant to giving these refunds, unless, again, the Supreme Court does something unexpected and says blanket refund, right? Or Congress steps in, because that's the other thing, right? Congress can pass a law mandating the refund of these tariffs. Imagine that, right? They actually do something other than go on television and yell at each other. But I think, unfortunately, it's gonna get pretty messy, and there have actually been some lawyers that have now filed a class action suit to get the money back. Because one of the questions is every single person going to have to file a lawsuit to get this back? Even if they don't, though, and this is what I think is really frustrating, is even if they don't have to do the lawsuit thing, the administrative refund process is pretty burdensome for little guys. You have to actually go back and protest these old entries. That's the actual name, file a protest. And then you have to file these what called post-summary corrections. I mean, it's a lot of paperwork. And again, you're not talking about a few entries. You're talking about customs processes more than 100,000 entries of imports every day. And we're talking about global tariffs that would need to be refunded. So for both importers and the government, this could be quite burdensome.
The higher prices put on consumers are not going to be this.
Yeah, I don't know. This is, I think, one of the more interesting things. As refunds go forward, how many businesses are going to actually be like, no, we're going to have a little tariff refund sale, right? Because or we're going to do some sort of marketing campaign to excite consumers to get back in there, right? Because this is going to be front page news. It's going to be on every TV. Consumers are going to be well aware that suddenly Walmart or whoever is going to just had a little windfall, right? I think some will, of course, try to just keep the money and keep prices higher. That's how the market works. But I think there are going to be others that actually try to take advantage of this to gain new customers.
Competition is going to drive them to rebate a lot of it to consumers. And isn't it the case? I mean, is it the very fact that the administration plays up the revenue side of these tariffs? I mean, that undermines the legal case, right?
It's so funny.
He tried to kind of say, well, no, it's just a byproduct. And
yeah. So it's actually pretty hilarious. Classic Trump, right? So in the Supreme Court oral arguments, there was a massive, long discussion about, no, these aren't revenue tariffs, these are regulatory tariffs. Even though in their briefs, they talk about all the money they're raising, right? And the New York Times had a very smart piece about how the government over the last few months has actually shifted away from bragging about all the revenue they're bringing in to talking about the IEPA tariffs as being about making trade deals and getting China to cave on fentanyl. And I actually think the China deal was in part motivated by them trying to bulletproof their Supreme Court arguments. And then yesterday, I mean, literally the day after all of this discussion, Trump's on TV talking about how much money they're raising. I mean, because, he's a walking id. The guy just says whatever. And so, I mean, pretty comical that he's cutting off his lawyer's branch, right, as he's out there on that limb.
Yeah. Go. Good. I'm glad he did.
Yeah, I know. Thanks. It's very helpful for us.
Very quickly before we go, I want to ask you about reform. Each one of you, it's like, what reform would you each support to prevent abuse of emergency economic powers, or like maybe more specific statutory limits like sunset clause or mandatory congressional review? Like how? Like what?
Those are all good ideas. I mean, Scott would have better sense of the landscape than me, but I mean, I've become pretty radical in this. I wish Congress would eliminate all emergency powers for the executive branch. That's not going to happen. I understand that because people are worried about national security. But as long as emergency powers exist in any form, they will be abused. And so the best we can hope for is that Congress finds a pulse and reforms the legislation such that it makes the restrictions on those emergency powers more specific in terms of time and in terms of scope.
Because isn't it the case, for instance, let's say they define the statute in a much more a narrow way, right? And then there's an emergency that happens and the president is in need of something that is not allowed in the statute. It can go and beg Congress to actually say, can you give me that power? Or can you right? In theory, this is how it should work, right?
Yeah. And so going back to your question, I think there are three areas for reform. One is, as Don mentioned, on national emergencies. There's actually been very good legislation offered by Rand Paul and Tim Kaine. So a bipartisan group. Yeah. It was very close to passing. And I'll depress you on this a good bit. In December of last year, this thing was teed up to be included in must-pass legislation at the end of the year. And it had a big kind of critical mass of votes. And then, of course, Donald Trump won and Republicans all abandoned their support for this.
Yeah,
so and if we had passed this, we would not be here right now.
Yeah.
Because what it was going to do was reform the National Emergencies Act to effectively require Congress to affirmatively approve a declaration of national emergency instead of what it is now. Now they can disapprove, but of course that is a different dynamic, and the default is what matters. And this would default.
There's no legislative veto anymore either.
Right, so. Exactly. So the default would change. So that's the first one.
Yeah, okay. But is this kind of experience we've just had, kind of encourage them to do that? Because I mean, if you're Democrats or Republicans, you've kind of learned.
Well,
and the Supreme Court has actually said, yeah, I mean, they can go and this is how it could be used.
So maybe if Democrats take control of the House and Senate, you could see something here. Until that happens, the House is a stone wall, and you're just not going to see it. But obviously that's the place to start. The other, though, getting wonkier is that, look, our trade laws need reform, not just IEPA, but all the other laws that I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. The reality is that they were drafted under the now proven incorrect assumption that the president would be a responsible steward of these powers. And Trump has proven that to be false. Biden has proved it too, by the way, right? Those 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, absolutely ridiculous as an unfair trading issue, right? So there are two legislative proposals that have actually look to do this. One is what I would prefer, which is actually going in and pruning every law to be more objective, more limited, or in some cases just simply repealed. There are a couple laws on the books that just they shouldn't be there. And we might learn about one of them, Section 338, if these IEPA tariffs are overruled. The second one is a cop-out, but it's still better. And that is that it requires Congress to affirmatively approve any presidential tariff action under those laws. And if they don't, then they can only be in place for, 60 days, 100 days, whatever, right? So that's not as good of a policy solution, but it is, I think, a good political solution. And it would be useful because it would limit the president's powers. It would give Congress, again, a say in this stuff, because right now Congress has no say, even though it has the constitutional authority. And again, to kind of depress the audience a bit, there have been bipartisan coalitions supporting that kind of legislation since Trump took office. And every time the presidency changes, a different coalition emerges. And of course, it's the opposing party. Right. And that's the big problem. And as a broader point, this is the problem with these delegations of congressional power. Once you give them over, it is almost impossible to get them back. And I was pleased actually to hear the Supreme Court oral arguments get into this. They kept pressing the Solicitor General and saying, who's ever going to get a veto-proof majority to change these rules? Right. And he had no answer for that. He just went, oh, well, that's the process.
Mm-hmm. So quick exit question to you guys. What's your best guess for what the Supreme Court's going to do? And I get that the oral argument doesn't necessarily kind of predict, tell you a ton, but if you had to guess.
I'm going to let Scott have the last word since his word is wiser than mine. But my guess is, and I feel it with maybe 60, 40, 65, 35 confidence that we'll get a 6-3 ruling for the good guys. I wish it would be a 9-0 ruling. I wish I had even more confidence. I would not be shocked if the ruling went in favor of the bad guys. But given what seems to have happened on Wednesday, I think the good guys are going to win at least a narrow victory.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I'll just add a couple things. Markets are useful in this regard, and betting markets have tilted increasingly against the administration here. Polymarket, Predicted, Kalshi have all now gotten into the 25% chance range that the administration is going to win. And that's down from about a 50-50. So that's good. The other market that's fascinating is the market for tariff refund claims. So a lot of investment banks are going to companies that might be owed refunds, and they're buying their claims. So it'll be like investment banks suing the government, which is fascinating, right? But right after the oral arguments, the price of those claims actually went up, meaning that investment banks are having to pay more for them. So again, that gives us some confidence that people are getting more enthused. I was always a coin toss guy. In fact, one of the reasons we argued so strenuously before the election last year that they need to reform these laws, including IEPA, is because the ambiguity is big. The foreign affairs power, Article 2 powers, the prudential and institutional things that John Roberts cares about, these make it a unnecessary risk. And so I still, again, like Don, I would not be shocked if the court ruled for the administration, but I am reasonably optimistic that we'll get a good decision.
Fingers crossed, guys. I hope. Markets can be wrong.
They can,
but I'm hoping this time they're dead on. Thanks so much.
This will be the biggest case of our lifetimes.
I think that is true because of the emergency.
Exactly.
On emergency.
Stanford's Michael McConnell, constitutional law expert, said it's the biggest case on separation of powers since at least the 1950s, and maybe even longer. It's a massive, massive deal, and the tariff part of it is only a little.
That's right.
You guys are the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vero.